I always try to pick my sermon title early in the week, and so the sermon title I have works, but if I were redoing it, I would have had a different title. And it would have been, Doing What Doesn't Come Naturally. And the reason I would say that is because I think that lots of times in church, what we do is we seek to do what doesn't come naturally. Because when we're following Jesus Christ and when we're seeking to be disciples, we end up doing things that seem to us as human beings outside of what we would ordinarily do on our own. And we do things that to people around us seem unnatural. And as a matter of fact, I actually think and hope that all through our capital stewardship journey that this has been a little bit odd for you. Because if we were just doing this as a civic organization, if we were raising money for mission and for transforming our buildings so that we can shape it to the mission that we believe God's given us, it would be about one thing. It would be about money. It would be all about the dollars and cents. It would be about how much we have to get. It would be about how much you have to give. And it would be over and over and over again focused on the dollar signs. Because that's what comes naturally when we're talking about fundraising. But the difference is that we have tried to do something that doesn't come quite as naturally. And maybe it doesn't seem quite as direct. You know, many of us are comfortable with appeals for money. We get them in the mail, we get phone calls about it all the time, and we think to ourselves, it's pretty straightforward. But instead, our challenge has not so much been about money, but about something far deeper and far more important. Our challenge has been about discipleship. It's been about following Jesus. And then out of our discipleship grows generosity and grows stewardship. You see, because stewardship is very different than fundraising. Stewardship grows out of the recognition that everything belongs to the Lord, and we give back out of all that we've been given with gratitude and thanksgiving so that God's work can take place. And this week, as I was studying this passage, I came across this great passage from a commentator from the 1700s, and he said this about discipleship. He said, "The foundation of Christianity, to be Christ's disciple. Its summit, to be Christ's disciple." It's my hope and it's my prayer that everything that we do as a congregation and everything that we do as Christian people is really about discipleship, and that everything else that we do will grow out of our desire to be Christ's disciples and to follow him and to serve him in everything that we do. It's my prayer for us as a church that every decision that we make will be guided by our desire to grow disciples, people who follow and are obedient to Jesus Christ and want to bear witness to his love and his grace and his mercy for the world, especially for our neighbors. And when Jesus talks about this, in the passage that we read this morning, he uses a particular image. He talks about being fruitful, bearing fruit. You know, in the children's message, I talked just briefly about bearing fruit, and you think about what's good about fruit is that it's sweet and it's delicious, and it even looks beautiful. It's really a gift, and it's something that gives nourishment and strength. Jesus calls us to be people who bear fruit. But the thing about bearing fruit is, in many ways, it's not what comes naturally, but it's something that is a challenge, and it's something that we can only do if we receive this ability as a gift from God. And here's the other thing. Sometimes I think when we think about bearing fruit, it makes us feel intimidated, because perhaps if you're like me, you always think, well, maybe I'm not fruitful enough, or the fruit I produce isn't perhaps sweet enough, or rich enough, or good enough. And sometimes I think even in the Bible we get this image. You know, Jesus picks up on this image of the vineyard. And the vineyard was a very common image in the Old Testament to talk about God's people. But the thing about the vineyard is it was often used as a way to talk about God's judgment on God's people. Many scholars believe that the passage that we read this morning in Jesus' reference to this vineyard comes from Isaiah chapter 5, where the prophet Isaiah is talking to God's people and he's pronouncing judgment on them. And it basically goes like this. It says, I bought this land and I planted a vineyard and I put in a grape press. And I expected that it would produce wonderful fruit and wonderful wine that could be enjoyed. He said, but this vineyard never produced that sweet fruit or that great wine, but instead it grew only wild and sour grapes. It became overgrown, and now I'm going to tear down its walls, and it will be destroyed. But I love what Jesus does with this image of the vineyard, because he takes something that really is often in the Old Testament talked about in terms of judgment, but instead of talking about it, just turns it around and he uses encouragement. Jesus says that God like this is cultivating. And God's expectation is that this vineyard will be fruitful. It will produce something that's good for the world, that you will produce things that are good for the world. But then he talks about it as this active sense of cultivating this vineyard. But even as I read this passage, I came across a particular point that made me feel a little bit anxious. He talks about cutting off limbs and throwing them into the fire. And it does make me a little bit anxious. And Jesus even says this. He says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. I think we could read this passage, this single verse in isolation, and we could think that being fruitful is all about us. It's about our ability to remain attached to Jesus. It's about what we produce and what we do, and if we don't do enough, then God's going to lop us off and throw us into the fire. But is that really what this passage is saying? Is that really the message of John's gospel? Is that really part of Jesus' call to be fruitful, that you have to be doing more? I actually think it's not. You see, the first 14 chapters of John's gospel aren't about what we do, but it's actually about what God has done in Jesus Christ. And it starts in the very beginning of the gospel. Remember the very beginning of John, where it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. It goes on, and I'm going to show you what Eugene Peterson, how he translates this passage. It's a little later. It's from John 1:14. He says, the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. I love the way that Eugene Peterson talks about this and translates that for us. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. I actually think it gives us a little bit of an insight into what it means for us to be fruitful disciples. Because as we think about what it means to be fruitful disciples, one of the things we often talk about is becoming more like Jesus. We want to be like him. We want to live like him. We want to look like him. And how do we do that? Well, right here in this translation, it says that he moved into the neighborhood. That Jesus, by decision and by God's design, was involved in the life of the world and of the community in which he was placed. And he poured himself out for the community, and he gave his life away for the sake of those around him, so that they would know and see God's love and God's mercy and God's grace for them. And if that's what Jesus did, if he moved into the neighborhood, don't you think that perhaps what God is calling us to do, what following Jesus looks like, is moving into the neighborhood, to being part of the community in which God has placed us, to be a witness to God's love for our neighbors, outside the walls of our building, in places where people would never ordinarily expect the church to be, out on the streets and in the local restaurants and out in the world, in your neighborhood. I think that for us to bear fruit and for us to be the kinds of disciples that Jesus is calling, it means that we need to learn to get outside of ourselves and to move into the neighborhood. But in many ways, this is doing what does not come naturally. You see, if you think about Jesus' image of the vineyard and of the vine, I actually think it was very carefully chosen. Partially because that image of fruit and that sweetness and that goodness is a beautiful image, but also because Jesus knew a thing or two about how vines grow. We've all gone by and seen vines that are growing out of control. And sometimes you've probably even seen them in your yard and you've had to trim them back. And you know what happens is that when you start to trim it back, the outside of it's green, but underneath it's all brown and it's dead, because vines have this tendency to grow in on themselves. That's what they naturally do. They grow into themselves, and on the outside you have this nice veneer of green leaves, and it looks like it's productive, but actually on the inside what you have is you have this mess of brokenness and deadness, and there's nothing that's alive underneath. If you want to have a healthy vine, if you want to have a healthy vineyard, you have to spend a lot of time out there clipping and pruning and making sure that it's just right. I remember a couple years ago, I had a conversation with Langdon about his vineyard up in New Jersey because, well, he wanted to talk about his vineyard at any chance he had. And he told me, he said that part of having a vineyard is this onerous process of going through and looking at each vine and cutting off pieces that have grown, because you only want just the right amount of growth so you get the right amount of fruit, because it needs to be directly attached to the trunk so as the nutrients come up, you don't have too much, because he says you might have a vine that looks productive and has a lot of grapes. He says, but the grapes won't be very sweet because it's not concentrated enough, because it's not growing the way that it needs to grow to be the most productive and the sweetest and the most fruitful. The same is true, like of the rose bush I have at my house. You know, if you trim it back just right, you don't end up with all this dead stuff on it, and you end up with fewer roses, but better roses. They're bigger and they're beautiful and they're full, instead of tons of tiny ones that don't last long. In our passage, Jesus tells us that his Father is the gardener. He says he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. This process of pruning is this process of cutting away, which is sometimes painful because it's something where God is challenging us and pushing us to do what doesn't come naturally. You see, I think Jesus knew that for all people, the natural thing is to take care of ourselves first, to grow inward. And actually, that's the tendency in many congregations. What we find is that when people talk about discipleship, what they mean is we got to do more stuff for ourselves so we feel better for ourselves and we feel stronger in our faith and we feel like we can face the world. But that's not the kind of discipleship that Jesus talked about. Jesus talked about growing deep in our faith and doing deep spiritual practices, not so that we'll feel better about ourselves, but so that we'll be equipped to bear witness to God's love for our community and for our world. So it leads me to think about this thing that happens on the airplane. You know, when you're on the airplane and the flight attendant gets up and they give you the whole spiel, you know, like the exit rows and this and that. And then they get to the point, if you ever lose cabin pressure, which I hope has never happened to anyone here, but if they do, remember what they tell you? If you're traveling with an older person or a child, what are you supposed to do? Pull it down, put your mask on yourself first, right? And then turn and help somebody else. I think lots of times we think that the church is like an airplane that's lost its cabin pressure. That our main responsibility is to take care of ourselves, and then if we have something left over, then we can turn and help the person next to us. But that's not really the image of the church that Jesus paints. And it's not the call to discipleship that Jesus has for us. The call to discipleship that Jesus has is that we would be fruitful people, that we be a fruitful congregation, that we be people who call others to righteousness and to follow Jesus. That's what it means to be fruitful. So the question before us today is a pretty simple one. What does it look like for us to be fruitful here in Ambler? I don't have a complete answer, but I do have the beginning of an answer. The beginning of the answer is that we would be people who are so overwhelmed by the grace and the love of God that we can't help but share it. It means that we will be a congregation that is focused on what happens outside our doors, even more than we're focused on what happens inside our doors. It means that we'll be a congregation that's seeking to grow deeper in our knowledge and understanding and love of Jesus Christ through prayer and Bible study and small groups and things like that. But there'll be things that happen not just here, but they'll happen outside the doors. It's my prayer that we'll become a congregation that has small groups that meet every night of the week, but don't meet here, but they meet in people's homes. And it's also part of my prayer that these small groups that we would have would be groups that would be open to different people who aren't even part of our church, but are maybe in your neighborhood, or maybe someone from your work. Because we believe so strongly that the power of God is so great, and the fruit that he wants us to bear is that people would learn what it means to know and follow him. That's the fruit that God wants us to bear. That people would know and love and follow Jesus. And that happens when we remain in him and he strengthens us, not to make it through life, but to bear witness to God's love for the world and for our neighbors. You know, the truth is, I think what's happening is that God is asking us a particular question about our church. I think it's a question that's important for discipleship. The question is this: who is not here that God is calling us to reach? You know, I think so many times in a process like the one we've had, thinking about capital improvements and all these things, one of the questions we ask ourselves is, how will I like it when it's done? But that's the wrong question. The right question is this: how will someone who happens to stumble in here for the first time on a Sunday morning experience this? How will someone who's walking down the hall, whose life is falling apart, and gets in a conversation with somebody from our church who loves them and cares for them and is walking along feel when they have an opportunity to step aside and have a deeper conversation? What will it be like for the people who aren't here yet? You know, the reality is that God calls his church to be an organization that's not focused on the people who are here, but on the people who aren't here. It's probably the only organization in the world that's designed to be aimed at people who aren't here, not to serve its members, but to serve the world. Not to serve ourselves, but to serve our community. You know, that's actually a big part of what it means to be disciples. That out of our love for God, out of our gratitude for God's graciousness and faithfulness and generosity with us, we respond so that other people can know and experience that love and that faithfulness and that generosity. Friends, I believe that God is in the process of building a foundation for our future. But the foundation for our future isn't built with dollars. It's really not even the building itself. The foundation for the future is deep discipleship, people deeply committed to following and loving and obeying Jesus Christ and bearing witness to his love for our community and for our world. That is our true foundation for the future. And when God begins to build that foundation, what we'll see is that God will do more than we could ask or imagine. That we will be God's fruitful people, just as we've been called to be. And to do it, sometimes we're going to have to do things that don't come naturally, but they come only by God's faithful and careful pruning, by God's intentionally pointing us away from ourselves and toward our community and the world, so that we can share his love with our neighbors. May God, by his Spirit, be at work in us in such a way that this becomes true of us, that we are a fruitful and faithful people, bearing witness to the love of God for the world. Let us pray.